Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust is frequently categorized as a quintessential piece of Gothic anime, praised for its lush, melancholic aesthetic and its status as a high-water mark of late 20th century hand-drawn animation. The consensus view frames the film as a tragic romance, a stylized, supernatural road movie that pits a stoic, immortal protagonist against the dying embers of a decadent vampire aristocracy. Yet, this reading treats the film's opulent imagery as mere decoration for a standard hunt narrative. A deeper examination reveals that the film is actually a profound meditation on the entropic decay of history and the impossibility of finding identity within a world that has already exhausted its potential for progress. The film's narrative is not a quest to save a damsel, it is an audit of a civilization that has surrendered its future to the preservation of aesthetic memory. The world of the frontier is a landscape defined by structural exhaustion. While the film's surface suggests a fusion of Western tropes and Victorian horror, the fundamental currency of this reality is the persistence of the past. The vampire nobility, or nobles, represent the terminal stage of a society that has ceased to innovate, turning instead toward the preservation of art, architecture, and lineage. They live in sprawling, decaying castles that act as gilded tombs, hoarding human history while the common populace dwells in the functional, scavenged ruins of an earlier, more vibrant age. The architecture serves as a visual hierarchy. The higher and more ornate a structure, the more stagnant the power contained within it. The film's geography is one of navigation through an entropic wilderness where the natural world has reclaimed the technological detritus of a lost golden age, leaving the inhabitants to subsist on the literal and figurative refuse of their ancestors. Central to this environment is the protagonist, D, who exists as a living embodiment of this systemic collapse. D is a Dhampir, a hybrid of human and vampire, occupying a liminal space that refuses to accept the binary nature of his world. His psychology is defined by the burden of his own existence. He is the product of an impossible union that the world deems an aberration. Throughout his journey, D maintains a detachment that borders on the ascetic, performing the labor of a hunter not out of a sense of moral crusade, but as a ritualized acknowledgement of his own nature. His trauma is not a singular event but a continuous, somatic state, the physical manifestation of being both the executioner and the kin of the monsters he tracks. He is a relic of a failed promise of peace between two races, and his existence serves as a constant reminder that the world's current state is a consequence of aborted evolution. The antagonist, Maya Link, provides a mirror to D's isolation. From his own perspective, Link is a romantic actor, fighting against the inevitable expiration of his species. His desire to escape the frontier to a place where he can coexist with a human woman is logically sound within his framework. He seeks to preserve his individuality against the erasure of extinction. The conflict between D and Link is not a battle between good and evil, but a collision of two divergent responses to the end of history. Where Link seeks to carve out a new space for the preservation of the self, D represents the acceptance of the void. The film's moral framework is one of radical existentialism, where the truth is that there is no trajectory forward, only the choices made in the shadow of total systemic decline. Visually, the film achieves its thesis through a meticulous fusion of traditional painterly backgrounds and aggressive, kinetic character movement. The animation style does not merely depict the world, it enshrines it. By utilizing deep, saturated colors and ornate, textured environments, the production design highlights the crushing weight of the past. The camera often frames D in wide, sweeping shots that emphasize his solitude, rendering him a tiny, precise instrument of violence against a backdrop of crumbling, immense majesty. The technical execution, the integration of sharp, digital lighting effects with fluid, hand-drawn character work, creates an uncanny sense of displacement that mirrors the character's own fractured sense of reality. The sound design, dominated by sweeping orchestral arrangements, reinforces the sense of a grand, tragic finale that has been playing for centuries. Ultimately, Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust concludes as a testament to the endurance of the individual in the face of inevitable, structural death. The final act does not provide a neat resolution, rather, it offers a fleeting, bittersweet moment of clarity that reinforces the distance between the hunter and the hunted. The film suggests that while the structures of the past, the castles, the bloodlines, the history must collapse, the burden of defining one's own purpose remains the only active defiance against the void. D walks away not because he has saved the world, but because he has fulfilled his singular, self-appointed role within a world that no longer has a future to offer. The legacy of the film lies in this unflinching commitment to its own melancholy, proving that the struggle to maintain one's integrity in a decaying system is, in itself, the only meaning available. The subversion question. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust is often categorized as a visually opulent exercise in Gothic romance, a film primarily concerned with the tragic aesthetic of the eternal struggle between human and monster. The consensus holds that the narrative serves as a sorrowful meditation on impossible love, positioning the Dhampir protagonist, D, as a stoic, detached arbiter of a dying, melancholic world. This interpretation, however, ignores the film's rigorous preoccupation with the obsolescence of hierarchies. Bloodlust is not a story about the endurance of romantic longing, it is a clinical demonstration of the total collapse of feudalist power structures and the liberation found in abandoning ancestral legacies. The film posits that the nobility of vampires, and, by extension, the rigid systems of social stratification they represent, is a parasitic vanity that must be excised to allow for a post-monarchical existence. The world of the frontier is a landscape defined by the failure of ancient, aristocratic legacies. The nobility are not merely monsters, they are the literal embodiment of a stagnant, horde-driven economy. They retreat to castles, hoard technology and art, and maintain a static order that prevents human evolution. The film's visual geography reinforces this. The vampires inhabit crystalline, Gothic spires that loom over a decaying, dusty earth, emphasizing a divide between the vampiric elite, who possess the resources of a lost, technological golden age, and the humans who are left to scavenge the ruins of that same history. The tension of the plot is not simply the pursuit of a kidnapped woman, Charlotte, but the disruption of the nobility's attempt to project their immortality into the future. Charlotte's decision to flee with the vampire Maya link is a radical rejection of human society, which is shown to be just as reactionary and xenophobic as the monsters it fears. By choosing to step outside the bounds of both human and vampire social contracts, the lovers expose the fragility of these systems. D, as a half-breed, acts as the ultimate agent of structural dissolution. He is the anomaly that cannot be categorized within the feudal logic of either group. His existence is an epistemic threat to both sides because he occupies the space between the binary of master and servant. While the human bounty hunters serve as clumsy, mercenary enforcers for the existing order, D functions as a force of entropy. His silence is not merely a character trait, it is a refusal to participate in the grand, self-aggrandizing narratives that the nobility and the human authorities use to justify their violence. When he encounters the barbarians, a band of scavengers who represent the lowest, most discarded element of the social strata, he does not seek to rule or command them, he simply operates in their presence, effectively neutralizing their petty power dynamics by demonstrating the insignificance of their goals against the backdrop of an inevitable, systemic shift. The technical execution of the film, particularly its fusion of fluid, hand-drawn animation with early digital compositing, mirrors this theme of decaying structure. The film avoids the sleek, digital cleanliness of contemporary science fiction, opting instead for a textured, painterly look that highlights the rot and the majesty of the world simultaneously. The camera movements, often gliding through vast, empty, ornate spaces, emphasize the hollowness of the nobility's domain. There is a weightlessness to the action sequences that belies the desperate, heavy stakes of the characters. When D moves, he does not follow the choreography of a hero, but of a force of nature that has already determined the outcome of the struggle. This renders the traditional monstrous threats of the film increasingly trivial, effectively stripping away the spectacle of the vampire as a grand, mythic figure and reducing them to pathetic remnants of a bygone era. The film's conclusion, which sees D refusing to mourn the lovers or celebrate his own victory, completes this dismantling. The consensus reading often stumbles here, attempting to find a moment of human warmth or tragic resignation in D's departure. Yet, this is a misreading of his autonomy. D walks away because the cycle has been broken. By facilitating the deaths of the lovers, he ensures that the noble's bloodline and the human institutional obsession with defining purity and status die with them. There is no catharsis to be found in the restoration of the status quo, because the status quo was fundamentally broken at the film's inciting moment. Ultimately, Bloodlust is an argument for the necessity of systemic erosion. It views the eternal nature of the vampires as a suffocating weight upon the world, and DS' role is that of a janitor cleaning up the debris of dead ideas. The film suggests that survival is not found in heritage or power, but in the ability to exit the destructive feedback loops that define human and vampiric society. By the final frame, the landscape has not been saved, but it has been cleared. The ghosts of the past have been evicted, leaving a barren, quiet space where something new might eventually exist, outside the gaze of kings, monsters, and the rigid moral hierarchies that attempt to define the limits of life. The anomaly question. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust exists as a masterwork of Gothic romanticism, often summarized as a high-octane stylistic exercise in monster hunting. Yet, this assessment ignores the profound existential machinery driving the film. The narrative functions as an autopsy of a dying world, proving that in a civilization built upon the stagnant immortality of vampires, the only true radical act is the acceptance of mortality. The film's central anomaly, DS' refusal to kill Charlotte despite the professional demand for his total detachment, is the key to unlocking its thesis. This seemingly out-of-place mercy is not a deviation from his character, it is the ultimate expression of his identity as a bridge between the decaying past and a humanity that must eventually succumb to its own natural end to remain meaningful. The world of Bloodlust is a haunting synthesis of feudal architecture and decaying post-humanity, where the nobility, the vampire overlords, reside in opulent, Gothic castles that tower above a frontier landscape of ruins and scavengers. This visual hierarchy serves as the physical manifestation of a stagnant society. The vampires have conquered death, but in doing so, they have frozen the progression of history. Their world is a masterwork of ornate decay, characterized by the juxtaposition of Baroque aestheticism and the rusted machinery of a collapsed civilization. The film utilizes this landscape to establish the fundamental scarcity of the setting, not a lack of resources, but a lack of futurity. Because the immortal masters have removed the necessity of change, they have removed the capacity for growth. The human populace lives in a state of perpetual, fearful repetition, trapped under the shadow of a master class that no longer has any stake in the survival of the earth. D, the Dhampir protagonist, embodies the inherent conflict of this reality. As a half-human, half-vampire entity, he represents the only biological reality capable of ending the nobility's rule, the capacity to die. His psychology is defined by the heavy, silent burden of a long life that is nevertheless tethered to the fragility of his human side. DS' interaction with the runaway lovers, Charlotte and Meyerlink, serves as the crucible for his philosophical stance. While the rest of the world views the vampire-human union as an abomination or a transaction, D recognizes it as a desperate attempt to bridge the divide between two incompatible modes of existence. His decision to protect their journey, even at the cost of his own convenience, reveals that his function is not merely to hunt monsters, but to act as an agent of inevitability. He allows their union to reach its tragic conclusion because he understands that the desire to love across the threshold of death is the only authentic rebellion against the stagnant immortality of the nobility. The film's craft elevates this thematic weight through a meticulous visual language of isolation. The animation frequently frames D against expansive, indifferent environments, emphasizing his role as an eternal wanderer. The use of high-contrast chiaroscuro lighting during his encounters with the antagonists, particularly the predatory Barbaro, creates a visual dialectic of predator and prey that mirrors his internal struggle. The technical execution, marked by lush, painterly backgrounds and a score that blends orchestral grandeur with melancholic, synthetic undertones, reinforces a sense of epic finality. The action sequences, which are often cited for their fluid, kinetic intensity, are not merely spectacle, they are the physical manifestations of the world's desperation, as the characters struggle to reclaim agency in a universe that has been static for millennia. Ultimately, the film posits that the struggle of existence is defined by its end. The climax does not resolve the conflict through a simple victory of good over evil, but through the realization that the vampire's immortality is a hollow shell. By the time the film reaches its conclusion, the binary of hunter and hunted dissolves. The final imagery of the film, D riding off into the horizon, strips away the romanticism of the synthesis question. Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust is fundamentally a tragedy of inertia, asserting that the pursuit of a transcendent romantic ideal serves as the only viable mechanism for navigating a world defined by its own entropic exhaustion. While often viewed through the narrow lens of Gothic horror spectacle, the the film is actually a rigorous study of how the desire for permanence creates meaning in a decaying civilization. The anomaly of the film, the uncharacteristic, near-total absence of DS inner monologue and the quiet, almost domestic intimacy of his final departure, functions as the definitive proof of this thesis. DS' existence is not defined by the violence he exerts on the supernatural, but by his quiet adherence to an internal code that rejects the nihilistic stagnation of the world around him. The sociological environment of the frontier is a landscape of profound scarcity where time itself acts as a depreciating currency. The nobility, representing an archaic, hyper-refined tier of power, reside in the sprawling, decaying castle of Chaith, an architectural monument to the unsustainable nature of their own history. In contrast, the human settlements exist in a state of perpetual, scavenged survival, navigating a geography where the natural world is reclaiming the remnants of a technological zenith. This environment dictates the behavior of every inhabitant. Humans operate as reactionary, pragmatic agents of their own survival, while the vampires are trapped in a performative loop of grandeur, unable to move past their own historical relevance. The tension between the dying aristocrat Maya Link and the hunter D is not merely a hunt, but a struggle over the definition of legacy. Maya attempts to secure his future through a physical migration to the stars, whereas D represents the only individual capable of existing outside of the system's decay. Psychologically, the film interrogates the fracture between the self and the societal role. D is the ultimate outsider, carrying the burden of his dual heritage as a physical manifestation of trauma. He does not view his condition as a burden to be cured but as a foundational state that allows him to remain uncorrupted by the desperate, clawing hunger that consumes the humans and the stagnant arrogance that paralyzes the vampires. His silence is the primary coping mechanism in a world that thrives on the noise of fear and propaganda. When characters like Charlotte or Marcus project their anxieties onto D, he remains a mirror, neutral, cold, and undeniably present, forcing them to confront the limitations of their own desperate philosophies. His interactions are never parasitic. He performs his duty with an efficiency that renders the emotional theatrics of those around him obsolete. Philosophically, the film acts as a rejection of both the nihilism of the decaying nobility and the frantic survivalism of the human bounty hunters. D operates within an existential framework where meaning is constructed solely through the act of fulfilling a chosen path. While the world demands he be a monster or a savior, he chooses to be a witness, operating with a deontology that is entirely his own. He is the ultimate anomaly because he refuses to participate in the collapse. He treats his moral code as an immutable law, not a reaction to the shifting tides of the society that fears him. This synthesis proves that while the world is dying, the individual's capacity to define their purpose remains the only absolute truth. The craftsmanship of the film, particularly the fusion of Yutaka Minawa's intricate, angular character designs with the lush, painterly backgrounds of the Madhouse production, reinforces this sense of an ending. The animation emphasizes a deliberate, weightless grace in DS movements, contrasted against the jagged, chaotic energy of the barbarian hunters. The visual language of the film, the sweeping, wide-angle vistas that diminish the importance of the individual, set against the claustrophobic, dark interiors of the vampire haunts, visualizes the isolation of those who dare to dream of something beyond the cycle of death. When the camera lingers on DS' stoic, unchanging visage amidst the crumbling ruins of the Chaith Castle, the image serves as the undeniable proof that D is the film's only anchor. The legacy of Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust lies in its refusal to offer the audience the catharsis of a conventional resolution. The ending is not a victory or a defeat, but a continuation of the struggle for definition. D rides into the horizon, leaving the world to its inevitable collapse, signaling that the most profound act of resistance is the refusal to be consumed by the decay. The film asserts that while civilizations are doomed to fold into their own dust, the individual who maintains their integrity creates a permanent, albeit solitary, monument. D remains because he has nowhere else to go and nothing else to be. His final act of compassion is not an alignment with humanity, but a commitment to his own nature. The film proves that even in a world where history has lost all meaning, the act of living according to one's own internal architecture is a sufficient defense against the void. Part 2. Context and world building. Systems, scarcity, and capital. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust presents a vision of a post-apocalyptic frontier where the fundamental currency is not gold or digital data, but the preservation of individual autonomy within a decaying feudal order. The nobility, the ancient vampire clans, possess a monopoly on aesthetic beauty and longevity, maintaining their power through the deliberate accumulation of artifacts and architectural grandeur. This control is visualized through their sprawling, Gothic castles that loom over the barren, rusted landscapes of the common folk. These structures serve as monuments to an era of dominance that is long past, yet they remain physically imposing enough to dictate the social and geographical movement of the human population below. The nobility exists in a state of suspended animation, hoarding resources and artistic treasures while the world outside their gates devolves into a desperate struggle for survival. The black market in this society is driven by the scarcity of protection and the human desire for normalcy. Because the ruling vampires have rendered traditional governance obsolete, the economy shifts toward the commodification of violence. Bounty hunters like D emerge as the primary illicit service, operating outside the formal laws of the nobility yet essential to the equilibrium of the borderlands. These hunters trade in the heads of the undead, creating a grim valuation of supernatural threats that dictates the life and death of the desperate. The existence of these mercenaries highlights a profound lack of security and institutional morality. The human world is a shadow economy where the only way to ensure the safety of a household is to hire a stranger to navigate the lethal power dynamics between humans and their captors. Labor in this world is inherently precarious. Humans exist in a state of perpetual exhaustion, surviving on the scraps of a civilization that viewed them as little more than chattel. Their bodies are physical commodities to be preyed upon, yet they also possess the only active agency left in a world that has largely surrendered to the inevitability of vampire rule. This tension defines the human condition. They are simultaneously trapped by the biological necessity of their existence and the technological superiority of their masters. The nobility treats their servants as both sustenance and decorative ornaments, further stripping the human experience of its inherent dignity. Technological gatekeeping defines the divide between the castes. The nobility utilizes high-tier, arcane machinery, starships, genetic modification, and reality-warping defense systems that appears magical to the human survivors. In contrast, the citizens of the frontier rely on scavenged, obsolete weaponry that is often physically dangerous to the user, such as the horse-mounted combat gear that feels like a vestige of a bygone century. This disparity creates a world where high technology is synonymous with isolation and inhumanity, while the common human is forced to endure the grit and rust of a world that no longer functions for them. The baseline normal for a civilian is a life of quiet, rural endurance, characterized by a fundamental lack of agency over one's own future. A standard Tuesday involves the constant threat of abduction or victimization by the roving monsters that infest the landscape. This atmosphere of looming catastrophe makes the disruption, the pursuit of Charlotte Elben and the vampire Maya link, a profound catalyst. The pursuit is not merely a job for the bounty hunters, it is a violent collision between two divergent ways of existing. By forcing the characters to traverse the gap between the decaying villages and the sterile, high-tech citadels of the elite, the film maps a reality where the architecture of power is a physical prison. The commoners are shackled to the earth by their own survival needs, while the vampires are anchored to their gilded towers by an arrogance that refuses to acknowledge the eventual sunset of their epoch. In this environment, the act of hunting becomes an assertion of human relevance, proving that even within a system rigged for extinction, the individual retains the power to disrupt the established order through the sheer, violent insistence on their own path. Architecture and the visual geography. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust establishes a reality defined by the intersection of high-concept Gothic romance and a decaying, post-technological landscape. The film functions as a meditation on the persistence of memory and status within a world where the masters of history are fading into obsolescence. Rather than viewing the environment as merely a backdrop for action, the film utilizes architecture and visual geography to map the profound distance between the immortal aristocracy and the human populations that survive in their shadow. The architectural hierarchy of the film serves as a rigid indicator of socio-biological power. The vampire nobility inhabits sprawling, ornate castles that exist as islands of preserved history amidst a vast, eroded wilderness. These structures are characterized by an opulent fusion of Baroque design and alien technology, representing a peak of civilization that has long since stopped progressing. The vampires occupy high, secluded spaces, their isolation reinforcing their status as relics who remain aloof from the mundane struggles of the dying world below. In contrast, the human settlements are clusters of functional, modest buildings that hug the earth, emphasizing a transient existence. This vertical separation, the towering, sterile silence of the castle versus the ground-level clutter of the human village, visually encodes the power dynamic between predator and prey. The production design meticulously manages the tension between the synthetic and the organic. The remnants of the natural world are portrayed as rugged and untamed, reclaiming the rusted iron and cracked stone of the fallen cities. The film presents a landscape where nature and technology have begun to fuse in disturbing ways. Metallic vines and synthetic flora sprout from ruins, suggesting a world that has evolved beyond the divide between the created and the born. This visual synthesis highlights the permanence of the environment in the face of the human's fleeting lifespans. The architecture often appears to be in a state of advanced entropic decay, signaling that the world is a tomb. Every rusted-out spire and moss-covered fortification reinforces the idea that the current inhabitants are merely scavengers living within the bleached bones of a golden age. Navigation through this world is portrayed through a purposeful movement that reflects the character's agency. When the protagonist, D, traverses the landscape, the camera tracks him through expansive, desolate plains, emphasizing the overwhelming scale of the world and the insignificance of any singular traveler. The geography forces a sense of loneliness. The long, sweeping shots of the frontier illustrate a world that has become too large and too empty for its current residents. In moments of transition, the film utilizes wide-angle perspectives that highlight the vast distances between the safe harbors of human life and the forbidden territories held by the nobility. These wide shots act as a scale-governing device, stripping away the individual importance of the characters to focus on the suffocating breadth of a world that no longer cares for its occupants. The visual execution relies heavily on this sense of scale to maintain the film's atmosphere of inevitable melancholy. The use of vast set extensions and detailed background art creates a world that feels both ancient and deeply exhausted. By prioritizing wide shots that incorporate ruined cityscapes, the film forces the viewer to confront the sheer volume of history that precedes the current conflict. There is no attempt to depict a thriving, modern society. Instead, the geography is a graveyard where the characters struggle to define themselves against the backdrop of an architectural history that is far older and more durable than they are. Ultimately, the architecture and geography of the film function as the silent arbiters of its moral universe. The ornate, unreachable heights of the vampire stronghold stand as symbols of a rigid, exclusionary power, while the chaotic, low-lying human environments represent the grit of survival. By grounding the narrative in a landscape that is clearly collapsing under the weight of its own past, the film reinforces its core focus, that existence in this world is a struggle against the entropy of time. The visual geography serves as a constant reminder that the characters are merely passing through a grand, decaying structure that will eventually consume all memory of their presence. Every spire, ruined city block, and desolate expanse of forest serves the film's broader intent to showcase a world that is not waiting for a future, but is instead perpetually dwelling in the long, dark shadow of a stagnant, immortal past. Epistemology, information, and society. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust presents a world where the stagnation of a dying feudal aristocracy mirrors the entropic decay of a post-technological civilization. The film posits that reality is a fragile, layered construct held together by the lingering myths of the vampire nobility, the noble, and the desperate, empirical observations of the humans who exist in their shadow. The central thesis of the film resides in the assertion that true agency requires the destruction of both the historical metanarrative, the romanticized tragedy of the vampire, and the mechanical certainty of the hunter, forcing a synthesis where the individual finds purpose only through the abandonment of prescribed roles. The world-building establishes a reality defined by the intersection of high-concept science fiction and Gothic romanticism, creating a society that is literally and figuratively haunted by its own history. The nobles, despite their immense technological and biological superiority, exist in a state of suspended animation, presiding over a landscape of ruins that serve as monuments to a bygone golden age. Information in this world is curated through the lens of folklore. Knowledge of the vampires is filtered through superstitions that effectively function as a propaganda engine for the ruling class. By shrouding their advanced biotechnology and transhuman capabilities in the aesthetic of the supernatural, the vampires maintain a psychological stranglehold on the human population. The average civilian operates within a framework of survival dictated by fear, where the truth of the vampire's divinity is a consensus-based reality designed to prevent rebellion. D stands as the film's ultimate anomaly, an existence that defies the binary categorization of the world. He operates outside the social and political systems of both human and noble society, existing as a roving arbiter of violence. His epistemology is rooted in cold, observational data, yet he is burdened by the remnants of the very biological heritage he is sworn to eradicate. The film treats the human element not as a biological constant, but as a series of choices regarding mortality. Charlotte Elben and Maya Link, the central couple, attempt to escape the determinism of their respective castes by creating a private, secluded reality, a radical rejection of the institutional forces that define them. Their attempt to exist outside the systemic power structures of the frontier is inherently doomed by the nature of their world, yet their pursuit of this space acts as the primary catalyst for DS' own journey toward a tenuous, isolated self-actualization. The moral framework of the film oscillates between the deontological duty of the hunter and the utilitarian preservation of the human status quo. DS violence is neither restorative nor punitive in a traditional sense, it is a mechanism of balance within a broken ecosystem. He is the personification of the system's own failure, a byproduct of the vampire nobility's hubris. By the time the film reaches its climax at the City of the Night, the collapse of the grand narrative is complete. The technology that once promised immortality has decayed into a prison, and the mythic power of the nobles has revealed itself to be nothing more than the desperate clutching of a dying class. Visually, the film employs a sophisticated synthesis of traditional animation and early digital compositing to enforce a sense of overwhelming, oppressive scale. The landscapes are characterized by deep, encroaching shadows and sprawling architectural ruins that dwarf the characters, emphasizing their status as transient figures within a history that has already moved on. The cinematography frequently employs a sense of atmospheric distance, isolating D within frames that highlight his detachment from the human concerns of those he protects. The sonic landscape complements this with a score that blurs the line between melancholic operatic swells and harsh, industrial textures, reflecting the tension between the archaic beauty of the vampires and the utilitarian brutality of the hunters. Ultimately, Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust concludes that the struggle against a terminal system is, in itself, the only meaningful validation of existence. D does not liberate the humans of the frontier, he merely facilitates their continued survival within a cycle of decay. The film's final imagery suggests that while the protagonists have disrupted the immediate power structure, the underlying conditions of the world remain largely unchanged. There is no triumphant resolution, only the quiet, existential dignity of a character who recognizes that he is a remnant of an obsolete age. The film stands as a masterwork of tone, asserting that in a world where history has become a weapon of control, the act of walking forward into an uncertain, lonely horizon is the highest form of defiance. The legacy of the work lies in its refusal to offer the comfort of a grand restoration, choosing instead to linger on the beauty found in the inevitable dissolution of all synthetic and biological structures. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust presents a world where the intersection of Gothic artifice and technological ruin functions as a definitive indictment of systemic stagnation. The film establishes a reality defined by the terminal decline of a vampire aristocracy that has outlived its own utility, existing as a parasitic relic in a landscape populated by humans who are themselves scavengers of a lost golden age. In this environment, the traditional markers of state authority have been entirely eclipsed by the erratic demands of survival and the residual, heavy-handed influence of the noble vampires. The law is no longer a civil instrument, it is a transactional arrangement, enforced by mercenaries and bounty hunters who operate in the vacuum left by a collapsed central government. This is a society where justice is purely synonymous with the extraction of value through violence, as the hunt itself becomes the only viable economy. The film's sociological catalyst is rooted in the utter exhaustion of the ruling class. The nobles, once the masters of this civilization, are currently collapsing inward under the weight of their own biological and existential obsolescence. Their power is no longer derived from a structural mandate but from the sheer terror of their history. This systemic decay is reflected in the film's architecture, where crumbling, opulent palaces serve as mausoleums for an elite that has long ceased to innovate, preferring to retreat into a state of decadent paralysis. When the protagonist, D, is hired to retrieve a human woman from the grasp of a noble, the action is not driven by an idealistic pursuit of justice, but by the mercenary friction inherent to a world that has replaced the concept of governance with the cold calculus of the contract. D functions as the anomaly within this system, a bridge between the dying, aristocratic supernatural order and the scavenging human population. His identity as a Dhampir, a half-breed whose existence is defined by the very power he is tasked to eradicate, illustrates the circular nature of this world's entrapment. The nobles are not merely targets, they are the architects of the technology and history that the humans now struggle to comprehend or control. By targeting the Vampire Maya link, the system forces a confrontation between the decaying past and a future that lacks the agency to define itself. The tension between the characters stems from this epistemological divide. The humans perceive their reality as a struggle against a singular, monstrous threat, while D understands that the collapse of the nobles will inevitably leave a void that the human survivors are entirely unequipped to fill. The technological landscape of the film further emphasizes this state of terminal decline. Characters utilize hardware that is clearly salvaged from a more sophisticated, perhaps even interplanetary, past, yet they apply it toward the primitive ends of subsistence and feudal conflict. There is no hope for societal growth or systemic reform. Instead, the film demonstrates an inevitable slide into obsolescence, where the most advanced technology is wielded by creatures whose culture is rooted in a feudal, blood-soaked antiquity. This creates a sensory environment of technological mismatch, where laser weaponry and cybernetic enhancements exist alongside the horse-drawn carriage and the medieval estate. DS movement through this world is characterized by a detached, almost mechanical efficiency, contrasting with the desperate, visceral emotions of the humans he encounters. His presence acts as a catalyst that strips away the delusions of his clients and the antagonists alike. He does not operate under the illusion that his actions will improve the world, he is a functional tool of the system's own self-correction. As the nobles continue their inevitable decline, D serves as the grim arbiter who ensures that their departure is finalized. The film posits that in a society built upon the husks of dead ideologies and broken hierarchies, the only remaining truth is the cold, unwavering performance of one's duty. When the facade of aristocratic glory is finally dismantled, it is replaced not by a new order, but by the quiet, crushing realization that the struggle was a distraction from the fundamental entropy of their existence. D remains the solitary constant, an unyielding manifestation of the system's own design, moving toward the next contract in a world that has no future to offer. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust functions as a profound meditation on the instability of the self within a decaying, post-human epoch. The film's narrative arc centers on the epistemic fracture experienced by Charlotte Elben, whose life-defining belief, that her love for the Vampire Maya link is a radical act of rebellion, is dismantled upon the revelation that her autonomy is, in part, a byproduct of the very vampiric influence she seeks to escape. When the truth of her abduction is unveiled, Charlotte's reaction is not one of abject terror, but a quiet, tragic reconciliation. She accepts the dissolution of her perceived reality because the alternative, a return to the sterile, human-dominated world, is functionally non-existent. Her trajectory represents a total abandonment of the individual ego in favor of a romanticized myth, illustrating how the scarcity of meaning in a dying world forces characters to anchor their identity in dangerous, fabricated narratives. The discourse within the film relies heavily on what remains unsaid, particularly through the enigmatic figure of D. His silence is the primary vehicle for his characterization, creating a cavernous divide between his stoic exterior and the violent, kinetic necessity of his actions. D is effectively stripped of the vocabulary required for human connection. His language is confined to functional, blunt pronouncements that serve only to delineate his role as an agent of lethal order. Because D exists as a hybrid, his internal life is a site of constant negotiation between his vampiric impulses and his human empathy. He is incapable of voicing the trauma of his own origin, the constant, recursive experience of being an outcast of both species, and instead directs that somatic weight into the mechanical precision of his combat. His body acts as a vessel for a pain he can never articulate, manifesting as a rigid, controlled physicality that rejects the vulnerability required for linguistic processing. The cognitive dissonance driving the film is most visible in the character of Maya Link, whose actions continuously contradict the predatory nature associated with his kind. He positions himself as a protector and a lover, yet he operates within a system that demands the consumption of the human. He justifies this through a private, insulated morality that prioritizes his singular devotion to Charlotte over the categorical imperatives of his society. This justification allows him to remain functional in a world that views his existence as a terminal error. He maintains a fabricated ego, seeing himself as a tragic hero defying the limitations of his bloodline, while remaining entirely dependent on the same hierarchical structures he claims to supersede. The human element is further complicated by the Marquesas, a group of bounty hunters who represent the desperate, fragile human attempt to impose order on a world that has already moved past them. Their collective identity is built upon the meta-narrative of the professional survivor. By adopting the roles of hunters, they attempt to create a sense of agency and purpose in an environment where humans are clearly subordinate. Their internal struggles are characterized by the dissonance between their hardened personas and the underlying awareness of their ultimate insignificance. When they confront the reality of their own obsolescence, they react with a stubborn, performative bravado, clinging to their weapons as physical extensions of their failing egos. Ultimately, Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust presents the self as a fragile construct, maintained only through the story's characters tell themselves to survive in a reality that offers no objective validation. The film suggests that the human element is not a set of inherent traits, but an active, exhausting process of self-definition performed against the backdrop of inevitable erasure. Whether through DS stoic isolation, Charlotte's romantic delusions, or the Marques's professional facades, every character is engaged in the creation of a myth. The tragedy of the film lies in the realization that these myths are the only barrier between the characters and a total loss of identity, confirming that in a world where the future is already written by the ancient and the undead, the only true agency left is the choice of which fiction to inhabit until the end. Trauma and somatic experiencing. Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust functions as a profound meditation on the persistence of memory and the somatic weight of an immortal existence. At the center of this Gothic landscape, D acts as the narrative's kinetic anchor, yet the film's psychological architecture is defined by the trauma of his lineage. As a Dhampir, the progeny of a human mother and a vampire progenitor, D exists in a state of perpetual physiological and existential friction. The shadow in Bloodlust is not merely an external antagonist like the vampire noble Maya Link, but the internal instability inherent in DS' own cellular makeup. The film posits that DS' struggle to maintain his identity is a perpetual act of endurance. His strength, which allows him to carve a path through armies of monsters, is inextricably linked to the same hunger and predatory instincts that define his foes. In the closing moments of the narrative, when the veil is fully lifted, the film confirms that his existence is a sustained, lifelong rejection of the path of least resistance. He does not find peace or resolution, he finds a stoic acceptance of his own duality. By the final frame, the trauma of his birth remains, but it is no longer a wound that dictates his trajectory, it is the source of a lonely, absolute agency. Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust demonstrates that the human element, even in a post-human landscape, is defined by the ability to carry one's history without allowing it to dictate the future, proving that identity is constructed through the quiet, repetitive, and often painful choices made in the wake of an inescapable origin. The shadow and the antagonist. Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust functions as a profound meditation on the entropic nature of desire, where the pursuit of immortality serves as the ultimate catalyst for human decay. The film establishes a landscape defined by the collapse of high civilization, where the remnants of humanity exist in the shadow of a waning vampire aristocracy. Within this hierarchy, the figure of D stands not merely as a slayer, but as a living manifestation of the tension between biological finitude and the unnatural stagnation of the nobility. His existence is defined by a rigorous, disciplined detachment, which serves as a necessary, if cold, defense mechanism against the chaotic impulses that drive the other inhabitants of this crumbling world. The antagonist, Maya Link, acts as the primary vehicle for this exploration of desire. His motivation, a genuine, almost tender pursuit of a life with Charlotte, a human woman, appears to be a romantic transgression, yet it is entirely logical from his perspective. Link operates within an epistemology where the traditional boundaries between predator and prey have been rendered obsolete by the sheer exhaustion of his species. His quest to reach the City of the Night is a pragmatic attempt to secure a sanctuary where his union with Charlotte can escape the violent scrutiny of both humans and the remnants of his own kin. He is not a villain driven by malice, but by the same fundamental human impulse for companionship that the film posits as both a source of tragedy and the only authentic act left in a dying world. This central relationship mirrors the plight of the protagonist in unexpected ways. While D is defined by his stoic isolation and his refusal to succumb to the bloodlust of his heritage, he simultaneously serves as the mirror for Link's choices. Both figures navigate a reality that demands total commitment to their respective paths, for D, the path of the relentless, detached executor, for Link, the path of the desperate, defiant lover. Their confrontation is not merely a clash of blade against magic, but a collision between two modes of existing in a post-catastrophic society. D's internal monologue, or his notable lack thereof, highlights his inability to participate in the domestic or romantic narratives that define Charlotte and Link's existence. He remains a wanderer, forever separated from the humanity he protects by the very nature of his own origin. The secondary characters, such as the Marcus brothers, emphasize the fatal consequences of failing to reconcile these divergent paths. The brothers operate as a mirror to D. They are human, yet their chosen profession forces them into the same orbit of death and conflict that D occupies. Where D embraces the solitude of his dual nature to maintain control, the Marcus brothers channel their trauma and resentment into a collective, hypermasculine performance of vengeance. They represent the human impulse to reclaim agency in a world where history and meaning have already been written by the ancestors. Their failure to survive the journey stems from their reliance on rigid, antiquated notions of heroism, which prove insufficient when confronted with the existential reality of the nobility. The film meticulously avoids the trap of assigning moral superiority to these perspectives. Instead, it positions these relationships as variations on the theme of survival. The dynamic between D and his symbiote, Left Hand, further complicates this by providing an externalized, parasitic consciousness that constantly challenges D's composure. This internal dialogue forces D to grapple with the parts of himself he works to repress, serving as a reminder that even the most disciplined individual cannot fully escape the impulses of their nature. The symbiote acts as a constant, mocking echo of the humanity D cannot claim, grounding his high-minded detachment in the messy, grotesque reality of biological existence. Ultimately, Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust presents a world where the lines between the monstrous and the human have effectively blurred. The protagonist's journey is one of witness. He traverses a landscape of decaying architecture and lost histories, serving as the final arbiter for those who choose to live according to their own subjective, often self-destructive, truths. By framing his journey through the lens of the shadow, the film posits that D's cold perfection is a form of repression just as profound as Link's desperate idealism. Through this tension, the film arrives at the realization that in a world where the future has been cannibalized by the past, the only remaining value is the preservation of one's individual truth, regardless of the existential cost. D emerges not as a savior, but as a silent monument to the endurance required to survive in an era that has long since abandoned the possibility of a graceful conclusion. The visual proof of the psyche. Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust presents a world where the human soul is caught in the recursive loop of a dying civilization, a landscape where the visual decay of a feudal, post-apocalyptic frontier mirrors the internal fragmentation of its inhabitants. The film serves as a meditation on the persistence of memory and the trauma of existence in a reality that has long since moved past the utility of the human form. By positioning its protagonist, D, as a silent, monolithic force within an expansive, crumbling geography, the film demonstrates that humanity's essence is not defined by its history or its social status, but by its capacity to endure the weight of an eternal, lonely identity. The environment of the film functions as an extension of the character's psychological states. The sprawling, decaying architecture of the vampire nobility acts as a testament to the vanity of immortality. These vast, cavernous halls and labyrinthine structures serve to physically dwarf the individual, reinforcing the sense that the human protagonists are merely transitory ghosts haunting the remnants of a failed godhood. The film utilizes a meticulous blend of traditional cell animation and digital compositing to create a world where light is perpetually filtered through dust and shadow. This visual strategy emphasizes a sense of profound isolation. Characters are frequently framed against massive, empty horizons or buried deep within the suffocating, baroque interiors of a dying aristocracy. The architecture does not merely house the characters, it imposes a structural hierarchy that reflects the insurmountable distance between the predator and the prey, forcing both parties to confront the stagnation of their respective conditions. Within this oppressive framework, the film explores the epistemic fracture inherent in being a hybrid entity. D exists as a physical manifestation of this conflict, carrying the burden of two irreconcilable lineages. His stoic, almost robotic adherence to his duty as a hunter serves as a necessary coping mechanism, a rigid facade that shields his humanity from the entropic pressures of the world. His internal dialogue, often mediated by the parasitic entity residing in his hand, functions as a constant challenge to his self-perception. This relationship is not merely a tool for exposition but a dynamic reflection of the struggle between the rational, controlled self and the chaotic, hungry subconscious. D's capacity for violence is clinical and efficient, yet the moments where he exhibits a quiet, almost imperceptible compassion reveal the fragility of his ego. The film suggests that such figures, caught between worlds, must adopt a performative indifference simply to maintain their sanity, treating their own bodies as tools in a universe that offers no room for vulnerability. The supporting characters, particularly Charlotte and Maya Link, embody the rejection of social conditioning in favor of an impossible, private truth. Their flight is a desperate attempt to create a space that exists outside of the established moral and sociological structures. By fleeing, they force the world to respond with violence, revealing the system's inability to process any form of agency that does not align with the cycle of hunter and prey. Their doomed union serves as a poignant critique of the film's rigid social order, illustrating that when individuals attempt to define their own meaning, the world treats that pursuit as a malfunction. The protagonist's journey alongside them, and his ultimate decision to witness their departure, transforms his role from that of a mere executioner to a silent observer of a radical, existential rebellion. The film's craft, its fluid, rhythmic pacing and its deliberate use of shadow, underscores the inevitability of this decline. The integration of the supernatural into the naturalistic, rusted aesthetic of the frontier creates a sense of tactile reality that anchors the more fantastical elements. The animation style captures the weight of clothing, the movement of hair in the wind, and the subtle shifts in eye movement with a precision that demands the viewer recognize these characters as sentient, suffering beings. This attention to detail ensures that the audience feels the claustrophobia of the setting, making the rare moments of expansive, open-sky travel feel like a brief, illusory reprieve rather than a permanent escape. Ultimately, Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust concludes that the struggle for identity in a decaying world is a solitary, enduring task. The film does not offer the comfort of a grand revolution or a systemic change, it instead celebrates the quiet resolve of the individual to persist despite the weight of their own history. By the final frame, the narrative circle remains unbroken, yet the protagonist remains changed, having witnessed the vulnerability of both the monster and the human. The film insists that memory is the only true currency in a world without a future, and that the act of remembering those who have passed beyond the reach of the living is the highest, most meaningful form of defiance. The legacy of the work lies in this unflinching look at the cost of survival, proving that even in a world defined by the shadow of the past, the individual remains the final, absolute arbiter of their own purpose. Part 4: Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. In Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust, the narrative functions as a meditation on the obsolescence of human history and the fragility of truth within a world decaying toward myth. The film posits a reality where the objective past has been eroded by the long shadow of the nobility, leaving the human populace to navigate a fragmented landscape where knowledge is no longer a tool for progress but a relic of a discarded era. The world operates on a strictly defined linguistic and social hierarchy. The vampires, as the architects of this fading reality, command the vocabulary of power, while humans are relegated to a state of reactive existence, defined by their fear and their desperate, often futile, attempts to categorize the supernatural occurrences that surround them. Truth within the film is not an objective fact but a fragile, contested narrative, heavily mediated by the trauma of a civilization that has surrendered its autonomy to an immortal, aristocratic class. The citizens of this world live in a perpetual state of epistemic vulnerability, where the boundaries of their understanding are dictated by the remnants of archaic science and superstitious folklore. Information is treated as dangerous contraband. The characters who possess true insight into the nature of the world, such as the Vance family or the Marcus brothers, do so by peering through the cracks of a crumbling reality rather than through any formal institutional framework. The film rejects the concept of a singular, state-sanctioned truth, suggesting instead that in a dying world, authority has retreated into individual obsession and private agendas. The nobility, specifically Baron Meyerlink, act as the ultimate arbiters of a truth that is inaccessible to the human participants, operating with a cold, calculated logic that treats human morality as an irrelevant variable in a much older, more expansive equation. The film leans into a profound sense of Cartesian doubt regarding the nature of the reality the characters inhabit. Characters constantly navigate spaces, the lush, grotesque architecture of the castle of Chaith, the desolate, haunted wilderness, that seem to defy natural law, suggesting a world where the physical environment is an extension of the psyche of its most powerful inhabitants rather than a stable, Newtonian space. Because the architecture and the creatures that occupy it operate on principles of blood, magic, and memory, the characters are forced to question the validity of their own sensory input. D, as a half-breed synthesis of two conflicting states of being, acts as the primary witness to this instability. He occupies the gap between the scientific, observable world and the mystical, subjective reality of the vampires, embodying the tension of a soul caught between two competing epistemologies. The post-truth condition in Bloodlust is characterized by the total collapse of shared history. Society is adrift in a sea of myth, where legends of the vampire kings have displaced documented reality, leading the populace to rely on rumor and ancestral dread to interpret their present. Because there is no overarching, reliable discourse to mediate their experience, characters are driven to extreme, individualized conclusions. The film suggests that when humanity loses its hold on the truth, it defaults to the performance of archetypes. The bounty hunters adopt the language of the Western gunslinger to impose order on a chaotic, post-apocalyptic landscape. The vampires perform the rituals of aristocratic refinement to justify their parasitic control. Both groups rely on these theatrical facades to stave off the existential void left by a history that has effectively forgotten them. Ultimately, the film presents an epistemic landscape where the struggle for meaning is a lonely, isolated pursuit. The limits of the characters' language reflect the limits of their world, as they lack the vocabulary to reconcile their mundane humanity with the supernatural dominance of the nobility. By restricting the flow of information and burying the past beneath layers of Gothic decay, the film demonstrates how power preserves itself through the systematic starvation of context. The characters are not merely fighting for their survival, they are struggling to maintain a coherent perception of reality in a universe that has already moved beyond the need for their recognition. The truth in Bloodlust is a haunting presence that flickers at the periphery of the frame, unreachable and profound, leaving the survivors to build their own meaning upon the ruins of a reality they no longer understand. Metanarratives and social theory. Vampire Hunter D. Bloodlust presents a world where the exhaustion of history has reached its terminal velocity. The film operates within the debris of a grand narrative that once promised human ascendancy, only to see it eclipsed by the slow, suffocating twilight of the nobility. In this reality, the failure of Enlightenment humanism is complete. The remnants of mankind exist in the shadow of vampires who are themselves remnants, creatures living out the final, decadent acts of an eternal play. The ruling class, the vampire lords, no longer exert power through vibrant governance or even overt brutality. Instead, they maintain their grip through a fossilized aesthetic of aristocracy, treating the world as a private museum of their own fading elegance. Their power is maintained through the sheer weight of their cultural history, a social architecture that convinces the human peasantry that they are destined to serve a dying sun rather than ignite their own future. This atmosphere of hyperreality defines the existence of both the hunter and the hunted. The environment is saturated with the symbols of a bygone era, Baroque mansions, Gothic cathedrals, and feudal armor, which have completely replaced the functional realities of a post-technological society. Characters navigate a landscape where the veneer of high culture disguises the rotting infrastructure of a world in collapse. The film illustrates a state where the simulacra of nobility have become more real than the biological truth of the species living within them. Because the vampires have withdrawn into isolated, ornate citadels, they have turned the world into a stage for their own melancholy, ensuring that the human population remains perpetually occupied with the task of merely surviving within the gaps of this static, haunted reality. Within this framework, the commodification of rebellion stands as the final irony of the society. The profession of the vampire hunter itself functions as a cog in the nobility's internal economic logic. Rather than destabilizing the vampire hegemony, hunters like D exist as a necessary market force, providing a regulated outlet for human resentment and a specialized service that keeps the vampire population pruned of its most unstable elements. The system absorbs the violence of the rebellion, monetizing the hunter's prowess to maintain the very status quo that necessitated their existence in the first place. D is not a revolutionary in the ideological sense, he is a structural necessity, a calibrated instrument that the system uses to perform self-correction. His journey, while physically disruptive, confirms the boundaries of the world rather than breaking them. Furthermore, the characters find themselves trapped in a feedback loop of existential resignation. The nobility's absolute control over the narrative of the end creates a fatalistic inertia where any attempt to seize agency is interpreted as an inevitable component of the tragedy. By framing the survival of the human race as a footnote to the drama of immortal, star-crossed vampires, the film highlights how thoroughly the ruling class has colonized the human imagination. The tragedy of characters like Charlotte and Maya Link lies in their belief that they can transcend this suffocating order through personal love, yet they are confined by the very tropes of romanticism that the vampire aristocracy has historically weaponized to maintain their mystique. Their struggle is doomed because they are playing by the rules of a game where the house, represented by the vampire's eternal, static culture, has already calculated every possible outcome. Ultimately, the film posits that when the grand narratives of progress and order collapse, society does not return to a primal state of freedom. Instead, it enters a prolonged, elegiac suspension. The characters are paralyzed by the weight of a history that refuses to die, existing in a state of terminal irony where their only meaningful choices are those that confirm their own obsolescence. The system does not merely survive, it feeds on the attempts to transcend it, ensuring that every act of defiance is inscribed into the tragic architecture of the world. Through its meticulous blend of high fantasy aesthetics and cynical social theory, the film depicts a universe where the individual is crushed not by malice, but by the sheer, unyielding density of a culture that has already finished its story, leaving everyone else to inhabit the silence of the aftermath. Ethics and the moral calculus. Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust establishes a moral landscape where the traditional binary of hero and monster dissolves into a sophisticated inquiry regarding the nature of the soul. At its core, the film functions as a rigorous exploration of ethical autonomy within a crumbling, post-apocalyptic feudalism. The narrative posits that personhood is not a biological or ontological designation granted by society, but an act of self-assertion performed against a deterministic universe. The ideological friction between D and the antagonists, notably the Barbaro mutants and the human bounty hunters, reveals a profound distinction in the application of force. While the bounty hunters are motivated by greed, commodifying life as a resource to be exploited, D's violence remains disciplined and detached. He does not seek to impose a moral order upon the world but to navigate it as a force of nature. This alignment of means and ends ensures that D remains the most consistent moral agent in the film. Determinism, agency, and time. In the Gothic landscape of Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust, the struggle between the individual and the crushing weight of structural history forms the core of the narrative experience. The film posits that in a world where the power of the nobility has waned into a state of decadent decay, the characters exist within a predetermined cycle. This is not merely a setting, but a suffocating philosophical condition. D, as a Dhampir, functions as the ultimate bridge between these structures, embodying a tension that refuses to resolve into binary simplicity. His existence represents a rejection of the static, immortal preservation favored by the vampire nobility, choosing instead to inhabit a state of perpetual, transitional motion. The film operates on the principle that the system, while failing, dictates the terms of existence for everyone beneath it. The vampire nobility, anchored in their decaying castles, view time as a resource to be hoarded and frozen. Their desire for Charlotte and Maya Link to transcend their social barriers is an attempt to escape the inevitable obsolescence of their caste. By seeking the city of the night, the lovers operate under the illusion that they can carve out a new space of personal agency, yet their journey is fundamentally a return to the isolation that the system demands. They are not merely fleeing, they are participating in a romanticized tragedy that serves the very hierarchy they wish to abandon. D stands in direct opposition to this paralysis. His journey is marked by a series of choices that appear to align with the contractual duties of a hunter, yet his actions repeatedly subvert the expectation of the mercenary. Where other characters react to the world as cogs in a machine, whether as hunters driven by gold or nobles driven by bloodline, D acts as a force of entropy. His presence is the catalyst that proves the system is not as immutable as it claims. Even as he moves through a landscape defined by rusted machinery and crumbling architecture, his agency is expressed through his refusal to be contained by the moral or social categories of either human or vampire. He occupies the burden of his heritage not as a prison, but as a site of constant negotiation, accepting the solitude that his position requires while maintaining a commitment to the specific, immediate needs of those he encounters. This navigation of agency finds its most poignant expression in the film's treatment of death. Death in Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust is not an end, but the ultimate marker of reality. The nobility's fear of extinction drives them toward impossible, artificial heavens, while the human populace is left to grapple with the ruins of a history they can no longer fully understand. D's capacity to witness the finality of these lives, the death of Charlotte, the departure of Maya Link, and the fleeting connections made with the Marcus brothers, establishes him as a vessel for the true history of the world. He absorbs the trauma of the dying order, ensuring that the individual's struggles do not vanish into the silence of an indifferent universe. The moral framework of the film is essentially existential. Characters are thrust into a reality where the gods have already fallen and the masters are senile. The final synthesis of the film arrives in the realization that agency is found in the interval between acts. The world remains a decaying structure, and the cycles of hunting and being hunted persist, yet the specific, singular choices made by D during his transit through this landscape retain their integrity. By the film's conclusion, there is no promise of a new dawn or the eradication of the darkness, only the quiet affirmation that a life lived according to one's own internal code is the only valid response to a collapsing reality. D rides off not because his task is finished in any absolute sense, but because he has successfully navigated the space between the archaic past and an uncertain future. He remains a singular entity, existing outside the systemic traps that claim everyone else, proving that while the individual may not survive the system, they are the only ones capable of giving the system its final, definitive shape. The struggle is the message, the motion is the meaning. Part 5, The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The cinematography of Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust functions as an intricate map of power, asserting dominance through a precise, architectural visual language that mirrors the film's rigid social stratification. Yoshiaki Kawajiri employs a visual hierarchy that consistently subordinates the human characters to the decaying grandeur of the vampire nobility. By utilizing low-angle compositions for the night breed, the film captures the inherent intimidation of these immortal beings, rendering them as looming, statuesque entities. This framing forces the human protagonists into the upper reaches of the frame, often cast in high-angle shots that emphasize their vulnerability and temporal insignificance. The camera itself acts as an objective, godlike witness, favoring smooth, sweeping pans and elegant dolly shots that suggest an inevitable, preordained destiny. This deliberate fluidity creates an eerie, detached sensation, mirroring the cold indifference of a dying world that no longer cares for the struggles of those caught in its collapse. The architecture of the color palette functions as the film's primary psychological indicator, grounding the narrative in a decaying, Gothic aesthetic that transitions with the shift in the protagonist's internal states. Early segments are drenched in the saturated blues and oppressive, muted grays of a stagnant frontier, reflecting the bleakness of a world exhausted by centuries of vampire rule. As the narrative progresses toward the Baron's castle, the palette undergoes a transformative shift, introducing warmer, more decadent tones, golds, deep crimsons, and sickly violets that highlight the aesthetic obsession of the nobility. This color shift serves as a sensory trap. The environment becomes increasingly beautiful as it becomes more morally hollow. The characters are essentially moving deeper into a gilded cage, where the vibrancy of the colors correlates to the tightening grip of a romanticized, archaic death cult that refuses to fade away. Depth and negative space are utilized as tools for existential isolation. In sequences where characters move through the overgrown ruins of a post-human landscape, the director employs deep focus to emphasize the vast, empty environments that dwarf the individual. Characters are frequently placed against the periphery of the frame, isolated by swathes of negative space that represent their profound disconnection from both their humanity and their environment. When they are confined within the claustrophobic interiors of the Barbary Coast or the Carriage of the Baron, the framing shifts to emphasize proximity and entrapment, using walls, pillars, and arches to hem them in. This transition from open, desolate emptiness to narrow, ornate confinement illustrates the shift from a world of lost opportunity to a world of absolute, unavoidable fate. The motif of light serves as the ultimate arbiter of truth in this reality, revealing the moral corruption that lies beneath the surface of the film's Gothic romanticism. Harsh, high-contrast lighting is reserved for the brutal, kinetic action sequences, emphasizing the grit and physical toll of the hunter's existence. Conversely, the film utilizes soft, diffused light to construct an artificial dreamscape around the vampire subjects, masking their predatory nature with a hazy, celestial luminescence. This lighting is deceptive, acting as a visual filter that aligns with the character's own romantic projections. When the light strikes the blade of the protagonist, it is sharp, clinical, and unforgiving, cutting through the diffused fantasy to reveal the hard, cold physics of his existence. This interplay between the natural, harsh reality and the artificial, ethereal glow emphasizes the constant friction between the character's desperate search for meaning and the objective, uncaring nature of the world they inhabit. Through these technical choices, the film crafts a visual experience that is inherently synonymous with its themes of obsolescence, reinforcing the argument that in a world ruled by the dead, the living are merely ghosts waiting for the light to fade. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust stands as a definitive achievement in the synthesis of hand-drawn cell animation and computer-generated imagery. The film operates on a visual philosophy where digital augmentation serves as an expansion of, rather than a departure from, the aesthetic weight of traditional illustration. By integrating 3D environments into a 2D-dominated frame, the production achieves a spatial complexity that mirrors the film's narrative commitment to a world defined by its own sprawling, haunted geography. The integration of the synthetic occurs with a precision that honors the consistency of the film's internal physics. When the narrative moves into environments requiring massive scale, such as the Gothic architecture of Count Lee's castle, the digital extensions maintain a high degree of fidelity to the practical light and color temperatures established in the character animation. The black levels in the digital assets are calibrated to match the deep, melancholic ink work of the foreground, ensuring that characters feel anchored to their environment rather than projected onto it. This technical cohesion creates a sense of tactile reality. The stone floors of the Baroness castle feel heavy, cold, and enduring, providing a grounded reality that the characters occupy with physical consequence. The physics of these digital elements reinforce the film's atmospheric tone. When objects interact, whether it is the mechanical grinding of the Barbaro mutants or the shifting gears of the castle's interior, the animation conveys mass and momentum. The CGI is used to facilitate complex camera maneuvers, such as sweeping tracking shots that descend through ruined corridors or spiral around D during combat. These movements are executed with a weighted, kinetic purpose, ensuring that the digital tools serve the choreography of the action. The film treats digital space as a physical environment where momentum and impact are subject to the same laws of gravity that govern DS' own movements, preventing the common pitfalls of weightless, floaty digital compositions. Invisible VFX are deployed with remarkable restraint, elevating the world building without drawing attention to the artifice. Throughout the film, the use of subtle digital compositing, such as particle effects for falling snow, light leaks through crumbling rafters, or the atmospheric haze of the wasteland, acts to unify disparate layers of animation into a singular, cohesive image. These quiet effects are essential to the film's identity, providing the sensory depth necessary to distinguish the frontie's harsh wilderness from the aristocratic, decayed elegance of the vampire strongholds. The result is a seamless environment where the synthetic components are indistinguishable from the traditional craft. The film's economic aesthetic reflects a high-budget commitment to texture and illumination. The CGI demonstrates a sophisticated use of global illumination and surface mapping, giving the metallic and organic surfaces a luster that complements the richness of the hand-painted backgrounds. This density of detail creates an immersive, Gothic atmosphere that suggests a world thick with history and decay. Rather than appearing rushed or flat, the digital additions are utilized to emphasize the grand scale of the frontier, using deep focus compositions to render the individual as small and transitory against the backdrop of an ancient, dying civilization. By mastering the technical uncanny, Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust achieves a state of visual harmony. The digital elements function as an extension of the director's vision, providing the technical reach necessary to realize the film's grand scale while maintaining the soulful, meticulous qualities of traditional animation. The craft resides in this successful marriage of mediums, proving that digital and analog techniques can coexist to build a singular, hauntingly consistent reality. The technical execution functions as the visual foundation for the film's central inquiry, proving that the beauty of the craft lies in the deliberate, expert construction of a world that feels as ancient and enduring as the vampires who inhabit it. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust establishes a sophisticated sensory architecture where sound, rhythm, and visual density function as primary narrative tools. The film operates as an immersive exercise in Gothic atmosphere, utilizing a meticulous sound design that bridges the gap between the organic decay of its post-apocalyptic frontier and the cold, eternal stillness of the vampiric aristocracy. The auditory landscape is dominated by a pervasive, low-frequency hum of impending obsolescence, which anchors the viewer in a world where history has been replaced by the mythic resonance of fading legends. The film blurs the distinction between diegetic sound and musical score with remarkable precision. Marco D'Ambrosio's orchestral score does not merely accompany the action, it integrates into the environmental soundscape, often bleeding into the Foley effects of rustling cloaks, clashing blades, and the wet, visceral biomechanics of the mutant enemies. This integration creates a cohesive sensory experience where the world itself sounds composed, reinforcing the idea that the setting is a stage upon which a predetermined, tragic cycle is being performed. The sound design treats the environment as a living, breathing participant in the conflict, elevating the physical setting to the status of a character whose voice is as authoritative as any of the protagonists. The sonic environment is characterized by a deliberate manipulation of space and silence. While the action sequences are dense with the percussive impact of hyperkinetic combat, the film frequently pulls back into a state of unnerving, near-sterile silence. This oscillation between chaotic noise and profound quiet mirrors the protagonist D's internal psychological state, a character defined by his own detached, singular existence. When D enters a room, the background ambient noise often falls away, isolating him within a vacuum of his own making. This use of audio perspective highlights his status as an exile who exists apart from the rhythm of common human life. Silence acts as a weapon in the film, used to emphasize the weight of D's presence and the existential stillness of his ancient, undead adversaries. The editing rhythm is masterfully calibrated to navigate the shift between the frantic, desperate survival of the human characters and the slow, deliberate grace of the vampires. During moments of extreme psychological distress, the cut speed accelerates, creating a staccato cadence that fragments the viewer's perception of reality to match the instability of the character's circumstances. Conversely, the film allows for extended, breath-heavy shots that dwell on the architectural grandeur of the vampire castles or the desolate expanse of the wasteland. These longer, rhythmic passages serve to anchor the film in its aesthetic identity, providing a grounded reality that prevents the high-concept fantasy elements from becoming purely abstract. The synthesis of craft. Vampire Hunter D: Bloodlust stands as a masterwork of aesthetic synthesis, where the technical execution functions as a primary engine for its Gothic romantic narrative. The film employs a sophisticated visual language that blends traditional cell animation with early digital compositing to establish a world defined by the tension between the eternal and the entropic. The director, Yoshiaki Kawajiri, utilizes lens choices and frame composition to delineate the psychological distance between the characters and the crumbling, archaic landscape they inhabit. Throughout the journey, the camera frequently employs long, sweeping telephoto lenses, which serve to compress the distance between the foreground characters and the sprawling, ruined horizons. This compression creates an inescapable sense of claustrophobia. The characters are perpetually trapped by their environment, physically hemmed in by a history of decay that renders their individual agency secondary to the weight of the crumbling world. The film's visual texture is a deliberate marriage of the organic and the synthetic. By layering hand-painted backgrounds with subtle digital post-processing, the production creates a tactile, painterly quality that avoids the sterile, flat aesthetic common to early digital integration. This approach honors the heritage of classic horror illustration, specifically the influence of Yoshitaka Amano, while embracing the fluid kineticism of modern action cinema. The interplay of light and shadow is particularly vital, utilizing a heavy, expressionistic chiaroscuro to externalize the internal divides of the protagonists. D, as a half-breed, lives in a state of constant shadow, his dual nature rendered through high-contrast lighting that physically bisects his form. The shadows in this world are not merely absences of light but active, encroaching entities that symbolize the Jungian shadow, the repressed memories, inherent biological urges, and existential anxieties that the characters must negotiate. The choreography of the frame further reinforces this theme of entrapment. Kawajiri's directorial style favors extended, fluid shots where the camera acts as an omniscient, detached observer. Instead of relying on rapid-fire, disorienting cuts, the film allows the action to breathe within the frame, forcing the audience to witness the full scale of the environment. In the quiet, transitional moments, the camera glides with a mechanical precision that mirrors DS' own stoic, pre-programmed efficiency, while in moments of heightened combat, the editing becomes rhythmic and visceral, reflecting the chaos of the human struggle against the inevitable. This technical discipline ensures that the audience remains grounded in the spatial reality of the film's Gothic locales, such as the surreal, shifting architecture of the Barbary Ghost Castle. Ultimately, the film achieves a perfect technical metaphor in its final reveal. The climactic imagery, which integrates delicate, ethereal light effects with the hard, brutalist character designs, acts as a visual manifestation of the film's core philosophical argument. The technical prowess displayed in these final moments, where the boundary between the living, the dead, and the machine dissolves, is the essential component that validates the story's tragic conclusion. By refusing to soften the digital edges or homogenize the visual palette, the film preserves the friction between its disparate elements. The technical craft of Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust does not merely serve the story, it defines the film's reality, proving that the struggle for identity in a dying world is a process of forging beauty from the wreckage of past eras. The final image of the film, capturing the cold, distant figure of D against a world that has no place for his kind, leaves the viewer with the profound realization that the technical perfection of the frame is the only thing standing between the characters and total dissolution. Through this marriage of light, shadow, and movement, the film cements its legacy as a pinnacle of visual storytelling, where every frame is a calculated effort to preserve the memory of a world that is already gone. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust exists as a masterwork of Gothic romanticism, transcending the superficial expectations of a creature-hunting action film. While the genre often leans into the visceral thrills of monster slaying, the film functions as an intricate meditation on the persistence of memory and the melancholy of the eternal. The narrative centers on a dying aristocracy attempting to preserve its own extinction, framing the vampire not as a predatory villain, but as a tragic figure desperate to anchor its identity against the eroding tide of time. The film posits that true tragedy lies not in the cessation of life, but in the impossibility of transcendence within a decaying world. The socio-political environment of the film is a masterclass in stratified decay. The frontier acts as a liminal space where the remnants of a technologically advanced past litter the landscape like forgotten relics. By blending high-concept science fiction machinery with archaic, Baroque aesthetic sensibilities, the film creates a reality where the scarcity of hope is the primary driver of human behavior. The aristocratic vampires occupy the decaying spires of antiquity, clinging to a refined, obsolete elegance, while the human population lives in the shadow of their former masters. This architectural hierarchy reinforces the central argument that power, once disconnected from the present, becomes a static, stagnant obsession. The emotional core of the film hinges on the bond between D and Charlotte Elban, which functions as the film's primary vessel for examining the intersection of trauma and existence. Their dynamic is defined by the profound weight of their disparate realities. D serves as a bridge between the human and the supernatural, a living manifestation of a synthesis that offers no belonging. Charlotte's flight from her family and her subsequent pursuit of a vampire lover is an exercise in asserting agency within a world that demands conformity. The film captures their vulnerability through a visual language of isolation, where characters are frequently framed against sweeping, desolate horizons or trapped within the oppressive, ornate interiors of the vampire's estate. This somatic expression of their internal state suggests that the core wound of the world is the lack of connection, which leads the characters to seek intimacy in the most transgressive and dangerous of places. Philosophically, the film grapples with the absurdity of a world that has already reached its conclusion. The antagonists are not merely monsters, but proponents of a specific logic that values the endurance of the soul over the survival of the species. Through this lens, the film explores the ethics of rebellion. When D moves through the narrative, he represents a force of inevitable correction, yet he is clearly burdened by the weight of his own existence. The film avoids easy moral answers, instead presenting a reality where the traditional boundaries between good and evil are subordinated to the struggle for personal meaning. It is an argument for the dignity of the individual effort, even when that effort is directed toward an outcome that is historically or cosmically doomed. Technically, the film represents a pinnacle of hand-drawn animation, utilizing lighting and shadow in a way that mimics traditional chiaroscuro painting. The integration of subtle CGI elements into the lush, hand-painted backgrounds creates a textured, tactile world that feels simultaneously ancient and alien. The camera work, characterized by its deliberate pacing and frequent use of wide, isolating shots, emphasizes the insignificance of the human struggle against the backdrop of an indifferent universe. Sound design further enhances this atmosphere, with a score that underscores the elegiac quality of the visuals. Every frame is meticulously composed to reflect the decay of the era, ensuring that the visual experience is inseparable from the film's philosophical weight. The legacy of the film is found in its refusal to offer a resolution that would simplify its central tensions. The final act does not provide catharsis in the traditional sense, rather, it offers a moment of profound, quiet acknowledgement of the nature of time and loss. The closing images, which return the viewer to the vast, uncaring landscape, reinforce the idea that the struggle, the act of hunting, of loving, of living, is the only meaningful resistance to the silence of the void. By the time the screen fades, the film has successfully argued that the beauty of the human experience is found precisely in its brevity, and in the refusal to let that brevity define the totality of one's legacy. It remains a definitive statement on the nobility of the struggle in an age of inevitable endings.